Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, September 16th, 2024, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santa Maria. And as always, before we dive into this week's episode, I do want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, this show is and will always be 100% free to download. And the way that we keep it going, that we pay all the people that need to be paid, is by relying on the incredible support from individuals just like you. The platform that we use is Patreon. That's patreon.com/talknerdy. That's where you can learn how to pledge whatever amount you'd like on an episodic basis to support the show. Although I think that is going to be changing soon and the pledge structure is going to need an overhaul. And so we're going to deliver more news to you, the active patrons, just as soon as we have it. I do want to give a shout out to this week's top patrons. They include Anu Bhadavaj, Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Rika Maharaj, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Pasquale Gelati, and Ulrika Hagman. Thank you all so much. This week, I had the incredible opportunity to chat with Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson. She's a marine biologist, policy expert, writer, and the co-founder of the nonprofit think tank Urban Ocean Lab, as well as co-founder of the climate initiative, the All We Can Save Project. She is also the Rue Distinguished Scholar at Bowdoin College, and she has a brand new book. It is called What If We Get It Right? Visions of Climate Futures. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson. Well, Ayana, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So we're going to be talking about your work, your scholarship, and also your new book, What If We Get It Right? Visions of Climate Futures. But before we get into the book, I always just want to spend some time with my guests to learn more about who they are and what they do. And I know that you are not just, I shouldn't say it that way, not just, but you are a marine biologist, but so much more than that because you work in sort of the policy area as well. I'm really just curious about your path. What did you study in school to get to where you are now?
My undergraduate degree is in environmental science and public policy. So I've always taken an interdisciplinary approach to environmental work. I just kind of the way my brain works is like, what are all the pieces of the puzzle?
And what do you think made you want to go that route so young? You know, I often think about how when we're first entering college, if we start at the time that most students do, around the age of 18, you know, plus or minus, some people are very politically active at that point, and some people still
I
haven't
was
really.
not.
You were not. Okay. Okay.
No, I mean, I loved nature, but that wasn't political to me. I would hope that it's not too political to, enjoy life on Earth. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, I was choosing between a few different colleges. I was really interested in going to Colorado College because they have something called the block plan where you basically take 8 classes a year, but you take them one at a time for like a month or something each. And so they have classes where you can like study geology in the Rocky Mountains or like take French and like really have it be an immersion experience. And I thought that would just be really cool. And they had a good modern dance program, I was told. So, but my parents were like, well, we can't really afford to like fly you back and forth to Colorado all the time. So maybe pick something a little closer to New York City. And finding this interdisciplinary program was also appealing to me because I didn't really have a favorite subject in high school. Kind of thought they were all interesting. It all depended on how good the teacher was as opposed to what the subject matter was. And I sort of wanted to become a marine biologist then, but I was told it would probably be good for me to get a more general education first. Like I considered going to a college in Florida and just going straight in immediately. And people are like, well, maybe like just do a more general undergrad degree because if you want to be a marine biologist, you're going to have to go get a PhD anyway. So like take the time to study some other stuff on the way.
Yeah. And your experience in learning about public policy, how did that shape your interests as you were continuing your training?
I mean, it very quickly became clear that it's not just a lack of good science and data that's holding us back from, um, you know, being a better species on this planet, I guess. That it really was a question of like, what are the rules of the game? How are we putting guardrails in place to temper the worst of our instincts to just spew pollution because we can get away with it? And so I very quickly became interested in conservation work, um, in national parks, in marine protected areas. I wanted to be a park ranger at one point because I thought, like, what could be cooler than hanging out in the forest and getting paid for it? And it was sort of a toss up for a while on forests or oceans as my field of study. But at the time, there were fewer people, it seemed, advocating for oceans loudly, but there were a lot of people like chaining themselves to trees and camping out up in trees to protect old growth forests. So I was like, the forest people seem to have it together. They're like fighting for those forests. I don't really want to chain myself to a tree. Maybe I could like go hang out in the Caribbean or something, like learn about coral reefs.
I love it. And so as you're like, kind of, I guess, honing that, or maybe I misused the word, homing in on this area that you feel like you can do the most good and learning more and more about it. How did that then translate? I think there is sort of some amount of artifice in grad school for all of us where even if our dissertation is like really meaningful and very kind of applied, there's this bubble that we're in. But when we leave school and we're going to do the thing, I'm curious what the thing looks like for you. Like, what is it that you do in this area?
It's definitely evolved a lot. I graduated with my PhD in January 2011. So it's been, 13 years. Um, and the first thing I did, well, first of all, maybe it's helpful to know like what my research was on to see if it's applicable. So I always love asking people what their dissertation topics were. Mine was fish, fishing, diving, and the management of coral reefs, as if I
Okay.
had solved like all the
Yep.
problems. So grand. Um, and but it is such a general sounding title because each chapter was essentially a different discipline. So there was like a fisheries biology chapter, there was an ecology chapter, there was a fisheries management chapter, there was a policy chapter, there was a socioeconomics, a behavioral economics chapter. And my one of my goals is to get all the different chapters published in different journals, like all these different disciplines. And I got pretty far before I was like, I'm not going to worry about publishing all these peer-reviewed journals. I'm just going to get on with my life. But I do actually have, a paper in environmental economics, as well as fish and fisheries, and I think marine ecology progress series, right? All these different types of journals. And I wanted to publish a law review article and I didn't get that far. I think maybe there's a piece in marine policy, but yes, there is. So, um, that was really fun for me to think about all these different pieces of the puzzle. If you want to do ocean conservation, you do need to understand all these different elements of it, or at least have the awareness of them. But my first research project was literally building a better fish trap, working with fishermen in Curacao in the fisheries department because they were going to put new fishing regulations in place. And they wanted to know if this fish design they thought might work that had sort of worked for a lobster in the Bahamas or Bermuda would like work there. Um, and so I just designed these traps and put out a bunch of different trap designs in a bunch of different places and did the whole, randomized design thing. And for months and months was diving every day, counting what fish were in them and moving them around to make sure I wasn't biasing by like one particular really good spot on the reef or something like that. And like 380 dives later or something, I had proved that if you put a slot in the corner of a fish trap, the skinny and baby fish get out, which is the most obvious shit you've ever heard.
Yeah, but it
But
needs to be documented.
you got to prove it with
Yeah.
statistical rigor. But the thing that really made that work impactful in some way was that I also did the math on the dollars side of things, right? If we let these baby fish out, if we compare these different trap designs, will that affect fishermen's incomes? And being able to like go to the markets, see like the average cost of different sizes of different types of fish and multiply that out, I was able to say, you know what, the fishermen's incomes are not going to be affected. So you can have this conservation benefit without, um, without screwing over fishermen. Um, and maybe have more fish in the future because they're letting out the babies and letting them make babies before you catch them. And so that's why the government was like, okay, we're going to require this new trap design by law. We're in. And a few other islands went for it too. And that was my first science project. And I was like, okay, so you can use science and then you can change laws. Tell me more about this.
Right. And it's because you were able to show that second half of the story, right? Not just here is a thing, and when you do the thing, a thing happens, but and this is then how it actually affects people who are living in the real world.
Yeah, there's a social and economic context to it all. And so that actually led to me shifting my work away from, fishing gear to thinking about, okay, well, let me talk to the fishermen. Let me talk to the scuba instructors on the island. Let me have a better understanding of what kind of policies they'd support, what kind of trends they're seeing, where are they aligned? Like the government's going to be really excited if both the fishers and the, um, you know, tourism dive operators agree on things. Like that would be an incredible coalition. Um, Instead of the divers like ripping apart all their fishing gear every time they see it underwater. And so that was like a very big practical lesson to me. I ended up interviewing hundreds of fishermen and divers in Curacao and then repeating all the interviews also on Bonaire. Um, and it was like one of the deepest learning periods of my life, just hearing hundreds of people tell me spending an hour or more with each person, hearing all about their history with the ocean and if they could write the rules, what would they be? And understanding their financial limitations and the types of gear they were using and all of that. And I was like, oh, this is actually ocean conservation.
Okay, I'm kind of obsessed with this now because my field is psychology and I did a qualitative dissertation and like you're describing qualitative research which I never really associated with biology.
Oh, absolutely. And so I would ask questions about like, how they thought the fish populations were doing, whether they were increasing or decreasing or staying the same. And you know how you have to give like an odd number of answers.
Right.
And to those, there was like 3 answers or 5 answers. It was like a whole thing, the snowball sampling method, where you ask one person, you ask them who you should talk to next. And I didn't realize all these things were like actual techniques until I went to analyze the data. And I was like, God, I guessed right, because I didn't have anyone teaching me how to do
I
this.
think that's how most of us do it.
I think so. You can't get away with that shit now, but like we definitely were just making it up at the time. And I mean, because my PhD advisor was a historical ecologist who studied bryozoans and corals in the geologic record. So, he'd spent a lot of time drinking beer with fishermen in Jamaica where he did his research, but, not quantitatively or qualitatively. Yeah. And so just understanding also the politics of it, the dynamics between it, the colonial legacy in these places. These were Dutch islands, like Dutch colonies. You have all these like young white Dutch kids coming to be scuba instructors, and you have these like typically older Black Antillean men as the fishermen. And the fact that they agree on anything is a miracle. But of course, there's a lot of like, it's their fault, it's their fault. And if you can't even agree on the problem, that can make it a little harder to agree on the solutions. But yeah, they actually did agree on a lot of stuff about creating marine protected areas as long as the divers couldn't go in either. Was the fishermen were like, fine. But they're the problem too. They're scaring away all the fish with their stupid sunscreen and their noise and kicking the shit out of reefs because they don't actually know how to control their buoyancy, all these tourists, right? Um, anyway, I could talk about this for hours. It was fascinating. And I was dating a behavioral economist for a hot second. So there was a whole like time discounting of money experiment that happened in there. And I actually like paid them all for the interview, but they had to do it in this way. It was like yeah.
Is it common? Well, I don't even know if you can answer that question, but it feels like owning, or at least that's a bad way to put it. Gosh, I'm struggling with my words. It feels like ensuring that this multidisciplinary approach is common, but it's not common when it's one person being the multidiscipline. You know what I mean? Like usually, and I think it is getting better in academia, but very often it's just the structure of our training models. You're somewhat siloed, and then you try to play nice with others, and hopefully you can tell a story with all those combined expertises.
Or you date them and learn about their research methods, but then like break
Exactly.
up with them before they analyze the data with you. And then you
Oh
have to learn
no,
statistics like 2 months
it's
before your entire
terrible.
dissertation is due all by yourself.
Like this is the only reason.
Yeah.
It's awful.
I mean, the thing that was so exciting about that for me was, I had a grad school that, at least in theory, supported that, right? We had a National Science Foundation IGERT program, which is the best acronym ever, Interdisciplinary Graduate Research and Education Traineeship, that was specifically for people to do interdisciplinary work. So I, actually had the funding that enabled me to follow my nose. And I had no plan when I got to grad school. I was like, something about protected areas, maybe. I don't know. Fish. I'm interested in fish. I don't like cold water. Like, these are my factors. Um, and then I actually, to answer your question, I actually oddly ended up using exactly that skill set because I ended up running a philanthropist institute when there was this transition to working with communities on overhauling ocean policy. And so I got to do use those interview skills again. I got to put together a scientific team to assess the reefs. I got to think about, gear restrictions as part of fisheries management and designing protected areas, and all with the local community, drawing all the lines on the map for ocean zoning. And so I could not have imagined a more perfect application of those grad school skills. But the chances of that happening were incredibly low. But I think the reason that, when I was co-creating that program, that I designed it the way I did was because that's what I had to offer. So another person designing that, I'm sure, would have taken either a more technical approach or a more policy approach or more economics. And I was just like, all of it. We need all of it. Who's the team? Like, let's bring together all these people. And I kind of have I'm very good with a pivot, which is necessary in those situations because like there's always something that comes up when you're doing this kind of community work and trying to push for policy change, especially when you're like an outsider and you're more like a facilitator and cheerleader than a decider.
That kind of brings me to, I guess, the big question at hand, which is like, what does your work really then look like? Like, what is the day to day?
I don't do any of that stuff anymore. Any of it. Like, I'm a marine biologist. I am Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson, and I feel guilty sometimes that people are like, Dr. Johnson, marine biologist. I'm like, I haven't counted fish in like a decade.
Yeah.
And so my work now is, I was actually inspired by, having worked in Barbuda for years, having, you know, helped coordinate this effort that led to them putting in place some of the most robust and ambitious ocean zoning and fisheries management plans in the Caribbean. And then Hurricane Irma hit the island. And the eye of the storm just like went right over the island. And there was so much damage. And it was just undeniable that I had to think more about climate change. My approach had been like, let me just focus on how much conservation we can do locally to buffer against the impacts of climate change. And that is still a completely valid approach to this work. But when I saw that, I thought, okay, let me zoom out a little bit and think about ocean and climate and policy on a larger scale. So one of my main projects now is I co-founded a think tank called Urban Ocean Lab that focuses on the future of coastal cities and um, how to put policies in place to help them adapt to the changes that are coming and are already here, whether that's sea level rise or the opportunity for offshore renewable energy like wind power, or thinking about regenerative ocean farming, seaweeds and shellfish, or protecting and restoring coastal ecosystems to buffer the impacts of storms and absorb carbon. There's all these climate solutions in the ocean, but also all these risks that are facing coastal communities. And we're just not prepared. So that's one of the big things I do now. But that work in the Caribbean, as it was going, I was blogging the process for National Geographic. I wrote like 50 something blog posts telling the story of how it was all unfolding. And so I kind of became a science communicator just because I knew the community wanted to be recognized for their remarkable efforts. And I wanted to not just, make a big announcement at the end, but have this be a process that other people could learn from in some way. Like take what works, leave what doesn't kind of thing. But like, here's how we did this. Here's what this collaboration looked like.
So I'm curious then, how does that look or how does that work with Urban Ocean Lab? Like, I think for a lot of people, the idea of a think tank is sort of similar to the idea of a consultant. Like, we're like, we don't really know what that is. Like, that's where you think of things, but then what do you do with the things you think of?
So we write a bunch of nerdy policy memos and do, analysis and make recommendations for how to change laws or priorities or approaches to make things better. That is incredibly general sounding and hand wavy, but like one of the things that we're working on now is thinking about this concept of climate driven relocation. So, because of sea level rise, because of all the impacts of climate change, there are going to be places where it no longer makes sense for people to live. And so, within the United States, in the next 25 years, it's predicted that something like 10 to 15 million people will have to move. We don't have a plan for that. We don't have a plan for the communities that are going to be having to receive people who have to relocate. We don't have a plan for making sure that poor people don't get screwed over, even though they had the smallest carbon footprints in all of this. Because if we don't have a policy framework for that transition, um, the people who have the resources to just pick up and get a house somewhere else are going to be fine, but everyone else is not. And if we don't have a plan, and if we just delay dealing with it, it's just going to be more chaotic and more unjust. So we're co-leading a coalition of organizations that's thinking about what the policy framework would need to be in order to have climate driven relocation proceed in the best possible way.
Does this work directly, or I should say, did this work, does it's still going on? So, does this work directly kind of influence the book you know, that we are here to promote
Oh,
today?
right. I wrote a book.
But I mean, that does
I was like,
feel like
let's
a
talk about grad
transition.
school. Sure.
I love it. I love it. Like my listeners are very nerdy, and I think
I
they
had
love it
like
too.
blonde tips then because I was like in the sun and the sea so much. I had like a completely different color scheme on my body.
Incredible. But yeah, so I mean, you edited this book that has essays, that has writings from all of these incredible researchers, incredible authors. Everybody from the hard science to the policy to the culture to social justice, and I'm curious, what kind of planted that seed to want to do this and put these solutions together in a sort of hopeful way? Is it an obvious I guess outcropping, an obvious next step based on the work that you do in the day to day?
hmm So, a big part of what I do in the day to day is climate communication. And those are sort of, I teach climate communication at Bowdoin College. I do a lot of it, although I would kind of like to just disappear into the woods at some point. Um, but I think that this grew out of feeling like there wasn't enough out there about what if we actually just did all the stuff we could do to make the climate crisis less bad? Like, what if we know how to do, right? We know how to transition to renewable energy. We know how to do green buildings, and we know to like insulate things and improve energy efficiency. And we know how to improve our food system and farm in ways that are more regenerative. And we know how to improve public transit. And we have electric cars, right? And we should have high speed trains in America, for the love of God. Um, and we know how to protect and restore ecosystems, which are something like 30 or 40% of the solution here. So it's not like a big mystery what we should be doing. It's just there are entrenched interests. There are people who are making a lot of money out of preventing those changes from happening, right? We've got like big ag executives and fossil fuel executives and the bankers that are funding them and the politicians that are getting all those dollars and getting lobbied, and a small group of people making a bunch of decisions about life on this planet for all of us and like the millions of other species that live here with us. And that drives me crazy. And I think part of the reason people aren't more engaged in working on climate solutions is we don't really have a good sense of what if we get it right? The book's title, right? The subtitle is Visions of Climate Futures. So this book is my attempt to answer sort of the challenge, like, show me it's worth it. Show me that this is worth the effort. We got to do all this stuff. We got to like transform our economy from extractive to regenerative. Like, is it actually worth it, Ayana? And I'm like, yes, I would say so. Here's a bunch of other smart people who agree with me and are working on different elements of this transformation. And so the book is 20 interviews with all these different experts, like you mentioned, farmers and foresters and um, lawyers and policymakers, government officials, investors, um, emergency management experts, indigenous leaders, youth climate activists, um, to figure out, like, even architects and designers, landscape architects, museum curators. It's really a delightfully diverse group of um, areas of expertise. And I printed them in interview format because I thought it'd be more approachable that way. I mean, for the same reason you host a podcast, right? Like there's something in the chit chat of it all um, that gives you the time and space and levity often to consider new things. And these are my friends and close colleagues. And so there's a existing rapport there that some of the early reviews of the book and the blurbs are like, oh, it feels like we're eavesdropping on a dinner party. So there's kind of like a little bit of a reverence, giving each other a hard time, joking around, because I just so firmly believe that we can take climate seriously without taking ourselves seriously. And so that's the vibe that I'm bringing to climate work.
And so it's real people talking about these real potential solutions, but not just like this is the way that we do the thing, but also this is what happens if we do the thing. And that to me seems like it's often missing from the conversation because I think there's an unstated major premise that doing the thing will just get things back to where they were, or they'll make things so that the way they are right now doesn't get worse. But what are some, I guess, examples that you can give us of how a future could actually be quite different if we actually had the political will, if we actually made the decision and sometimes the hard decision to do the thing?
The first thing I think of is if we get it right, the world is a lot more green, right? The world is sort of like got a lot of brown and gray in it right now as we've degraded ecosystems, if we put concrete all over the place, and there would be just a lot more nature, a lot more photosynthesis happening, which is a big part of climate solutions. So I think that's the first thing I think of, which I immediately am like, well, that's so much more beautiful. Not to mention like all this great oxygen we're going to breathe, right? And home for biodiversity and all the cool, weird insects. Um, but I also think a lot about the built environment because my dad was an architect, and I was sort of brought up walking around New York City with him, being trained on like what is a nice building and what is crap. Um, and one of the statistics I came across while researching this book is that 75% of the infrastructure that will exist in 2050 has yet to be built. We are literally building all this stuff, right? The roads, the bridges, the sewer systems, the whatever you can think of all the time. We could just build those in a different way. We could build them to be beautiful. We could build them to make sense for the amount of climate change that scientists are telling us is coming. We could build not at sea level, right? Like we could just do things differently. And if we think about just how much construction there is happening all the time, that would lead to a completely different world. We could also build in ways that we could deconstruct instead of demolish, right? We could just take apart buildings like Legos and reuse the pieces. I feel like so much of the, the sort of mess that we're in is because we've just not been creative enough. Like we have all these materials. Maybe let's just try to reuse those before we dig up more mountains, right? Um, and value the things that we have and repair them and remix them and all of that kind of stuff. So, yeah, I think a lot about just how the physical world could be different, how we could, have buildings that were just less drafty because we had properly insulated them or whatever. And it would just be nicer in a lot of ways.
And there are examples of this happening in parts of the world where there is new development and where old systems that were not, um, sustainable, that were not efficient, that we often hold on to or we modify or we improve. Kind of based on what we know. But there are examples, right, in places that are actively developing where whole new systems are being utilized. Like they never have to have the phone jacks in the walls because they never had the old school phone lines to begin with, and they get to start with something that's innovative.
Yeah. Skip right to solar panels on your house.
Right. Right. And I don't know why there's so much resistance to thinking this
Because
way.
there's like a handful of rich dudes who are making a lot of money off the status quo.
Yeah, and they've managed to suck out our hope and joy, and that sucks. Like they've managed to make a lot of people cynical.
I mean, the worst part about the like sort of anti climate solutions messaging, right? The pro fossil fuels, et cetera messaging is like, it's too inconvenient. Like, you don't want to like, oh, yeah, it's gonna cost money and like you're gonna have to like something's gonna have to change and like we don't like change and like God forbid you don't have a stove spewing gas into your house and like ruining your indoor air quality and giving your kids asthma. Like we can't possibly give that up. The risk of like blowing things up in our homes by like it is insane that we're not like, you know what, induction stoves are crazy efficient and like a lot safer.
Yeah, they boil water in 90 seconds. They're so cool.
Why are we not just like using the better science? It's like it's a literal upgrade, right? And so I feel like yeah, we're just told to fear change as if it can't possibly be good for us. But as someone who owns an electric car, I can tell you that it is like definitely better than the internal combustion engine. It is like faster. It is more fun. I don't have to go to gas stations anymore. I charge it from the solar panels on my roof, which is all a luxury to be able to do that. And the real answer is not everyone having their own electric cars, but better public transit. Um, but I think there's, you know, a lot of just like fear of change stuff that's happening
I think you're right. And I think that there's this.
because we don't have enough of these visions of what if we get it right, of possible futures. And so, I mean, if I had the skills to be a filmmaker, I would, write a rom-com set in a cool climate future. But I don't know how to do that. So instead, I just interviewed all the smartest, coolest, nicest people I know and was like, okay, tell me, what if we get it right?
Well, and I'm curious from, because you are somebody who's operated in this space. You are somebody who, has done a fair amount of your own investigation. But when you sat down with all of these smart people from all of these different disciplines and you said, what if we get it right? Was there, are there any standouts that you can point to that you learned where you were like, geez, I never even considered that? Or like, this is even shifting my paradigm a little bit.
Hmm.
Or were you like, yeah, I already knew all that, but I'm documenting it for posterity?
I mean, I had not fully appreciated because I sort of just ignore money. I like don't like to think about it. I like hate that it's so powerful. So I kind of, even though, like I knew enough in grad school to be like, I feel like the dollars part of this thing is going to be important. Um, I have kind of just avoided thinking about the role of banks. Um, and there's a conversation that I had with Bill McKibben, who's been, he wrote the first popular audience book about climate change in the 80s, I think. So he's been at this for about as long as I've been alive. And he, had done a lot of activism around getting, targeting fossil fuel companies and trying to shame them, with his organization 350 that he co-founded. Um, and then he sort of was like, oh, actually, we just need to stop funding them. We don't need to like debate fossil fuel companies into giving up fossil fuels. We need to get the banks to stop funding them. And the banks can make money doing any number of other things. They're not tied to this industry in the same way. And so he, co-founded the divestment movement that has moved many, many billions of dollars out of investing in fossil fuels, like getting retirement funds to divest, getting individuals to divest, and like city governments to divest. Because where you have your money is actually, this is the thing I learned from the book that I had not fully appreciated. Like where you have your money could be your biggest climate impact. You could be some perfect, like only eat plants that grew in your garden, walk everywhere, never buy any clothes kind of person. But if you have like 100 grand retirement savings in a fund that invests in fossil fuels, all of the good you're doing is outweighed by where your money is. And so I really I'm always telling people, like, is your money invested in fossil fuels? Do you know? Are you invested in the climate problem or are you invested in the solutions? Because people don't want to be on the wrong side of that. They don't think about it because we're not really presented often with these options. But for folks
It's
listening,
also not a sound investment in the long term.
I mean, it sadly should be less sound, but our government is financing, subsidizing fossil fuels out the wazoo, and so it's not a fair fight. But if folks want to look into other options, there's a website, bankforgood.org, that has different options for banks that are more environmentally friendly. Greenportfolio.com has information on like investments that are more climate responsible. So, yeah, I mean, it takes like a day. It's very boring. You like do the research, you do the paperwork to move your money, and then like you're done. And it's one of the most important things you can do.
That's huge because I think, you are not in the minority in never having kind of made that realization or thought about that.
Yeah. I mean,
Um,
I moved my money a few years ago because, well, I like badgered a friend of mine who works in fintech to like create a climate fund because I try to make all my friends do climate stuff with whatever skills they have. Um, and so I had done that personally, but I hadn't realized quite how big a deal it was. It was just on my list of like walk the talk kind of things. Um, but yeah, feels good to have sorted that out.
Yeah, that's amazing. And it's also really helpful knowing that this book, it's not just what if we get it right. It's not just what could the future look like, but it's what are those solutions now that could lead to that future and which ones, do I have more or less of a say in? Because of course we all do have a say when it comes down to being the voting public and when it but like you said, there's a David and Goliath thing going on that I think often the reality and the rhetoric, so the non-reality around the situation, it's easy to get super cynical and be like, doesn't matter what I do, big oil's going to win. And so having the peeling back the curtain a little and having this understanding of like, actually, my actions can affect change because they can actually affect the ability for like big oil to do what they're trying to do.
Totally. And you mentioned voting, right? Like we could elect politicians that are not funded by big oil. Like that's an option for us if we just paid attention. And we're having this conversation in a very heated election season, right? Where this is absolutely a climate election.
Yeah, there's a literal debate happening, like, right
There's a
as we're
debate
getting
that's
on the
starting in
yeah.
like 11 minutes.
Yeah.
And, you have on the one side Trump who said, oil executives, you give me $1 billion for my campaign, and I will just make sure all the laws are in your favor if I'm reelected. And who struck down 100 environmental regulations when he was in office. He was like, clean air and clean water, whatever, that's for Trump's, apparently. Like, corporations pollute all you want. No safeguards, right? And then, on the flip side, you have Kamala Harris, our vice president, who was the deciding vote on the Inflation Reduction Act, which was the biggest investment in climate solutions in the history of the earth. $400 billion or something like that. And so I think that's a pretty stark decision, right? But we're talking about sort of where an individual can make a difference. And, the presidential election, because of our electoral college, it really hinges on a few states or even like a few counties often. And it can feel like, your one vote doesn't really matter. And I get that. It does matter. Please vote. Please, please, please vote for candidates who get it on climate. But it's important to think about that, not just the president and not just every 4 years, but every year we get a chance to vote, and we can vote for the people who are making decisions about our lives in our communities, right? It's local politicians who are deciding, do we have bike lanes? Do we have a municipal composting program, right? It is the public utility commissioners who are deciding how fast we switch to renewable energy. There are all these things that affect climate, like implementation happens really at a local level. Um, like, is there green jobs training, right? How are we thinking about this transition? How are we adapting to sea level rise? Like, that's your mayor, your city council, um, your zoning commission that are making these decisions. So I would encourage people to make sure to think about those local politicians and whether they get it on climate. Um, and they need to hear from you, even after they're in office, that you want them to prioritize this issue. And I just want to give a shout out to two organizations I've been volunteering with for years and are actually coming on my book tour with me over the next month and a half, because I can't go on a book tour right now without talking about the election if I'm talking about climate solutions. So one is Environmental Voter Project, and they discovered that there is about 10 million Americans who are registered to vote and have climate as their number one issue, but generally do not vote. And we know how close elections are, right? If you could get just some of those people to go cast their ballot, it would make a huge difference. So that's what they do. And I volunteer with them, and you can sign up and volunteer and call folks and just remind them to vote. You don't have to debate who, just say, like, you know, these are people who care about the environment and they're registered. Just tell them to go vote. And then there's an organization called Lead Locally, and they specifically support local candidates running on a strong climate platform. So you can go to leadlocally.org. You can find out if they're supporting any candidates in your district. You can volunteer with them. Um, and I've known the founders of both groups for years. They're like remarkably smart strategists. They're thinking a lot actually about behavioral science as a way to how to motivate people to go cast their ballots. So I appreciate the sort of nerdy rigor that goes into a get out the vote effort. Not just the databases, but also like choosing every word so carefully to make sure you're encouraging people.
Absolutely. And just the volunteers, the boots on the ground that are, getting that word out too. It's so important. It's really cool that you've kind of like joined forces for your book tour to make this more of just a book tour.
Yeah, we're going on tour, 19 cities, 5 weeks, 30 events, like signing up volunteers, encouraging people to vote climate and to find their own role in climate solutions. I mean, there's a book I hope people buy, but really, I hope you find your thing, your way to contribute, and see what kind of good ripples you can make.
Well, gosh, I feel like that is a perfect time to kind of close out this interview so that A, we can catch the debate, and B, we can make sure that everybody, can learn for themselves what happens. What if we get it right? Visions of Climate Futures by Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson. Ayana, thank you so much for being here with us.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. I loved these questions.
Oh, I'm glad. Yes, I had so much fun. I learned so much, and now I
Thanks
want
for
to
the
dig
trip
even
down
deeper.
memory lane.
Of course.
Back when I was a scuba diver,
Yeah.
really salty.
I have to ask real quick, had you been diving before that?
I learned to dive in graduate school because I realized that I couldn't hold my breath long enough to count fish. And it was just like a skill I needed to do the science I wanted to do.
Oh, that's hilarious. And then you became like really into dive. I love that so much. Oh, love it. Well, we've learned so much tonight. And I'm also grateful for each of you for coming back and listening to the show week after week. I am really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.